Some of you have seen my videos on Richard Dawkins and his book, The God Delusion. In these videos, I talked about some of the reasons why I believe that his conclusion, namely that God almost certainly does not exist, does not logically follow from the arguments he presented, even if we grant his premises to be accurate. I also presented various experts in the fields of science and philosophy, both theist and atheist, who were likewise very disappointed in the arguments that Dawkins proposed. Now, Richard Dawkins has a huge fan base, which is why it's unsurprising that some people responded in a very hostile manner. For example, one person went so far as to say, well, if Richard Dawkins is wrong, then all of science must be wrong. So if you don't believe in Dawkins, you must walk away from the computer right now and stop using the fruits of science. Now that's a very extreme, over-the-top reaction, and most people would not respond in such a manner. I certainly do not wish to imply that most or even a significant number of Richard Dawkins fans would go to that extreme. The only reason I bring this up is to show the extremes to which some people will stand up for Richard Dawkins and his arguments because they like the conclusion that he arrived at. One of the more common arguments that I received, or counter-arguments I should say, is the following. You haven't proven that God exists, or alternatively, you haven't given us any reason to believe that God exists. Now, if you've seen my other videos, you know that this counter-argument comes up a lot, and I complain about it because it often comes up even when you're not attempting to present a positive case for God's existence. In other words, even when it's not relevant to the subject matter at hand. You can talk about, for example, whether religion is the #1 killer of all time, regardless of whether God actually exists or not. That's simply a different question altogether. Now, I do want to revisit that issue this time, though, for a number of reasons. First, I want to emphasize that I do present a positive case for God's existence in a good number of my other videos. In other words, I'm not simply dodging the subject matter. Quite the contrary, I invest a considerable amount of effort in offering reasons why I believe that God does exist. Granted, I did not cover that specifically in the videos on Richard Dawkins. That's because of the need to concentrate on a specific topic one at a time. Second, I do believe that this is an avenue for meaningful discussion. In other words, discussion between theists and atheists, Christians and non-Christians, is often muddled. And one of the things I strive for is to cut through some of the barriers that make these discussions confusing and often counterproductive. I think we have an opportunity here as we discuss ways in which people often think in a sloppy manner, both Christian and non-Christian, theist and non-theist. In particular, what people are doing here is committing the fallacy of believing that if A implies B, then B implies A. That does not logically follow. In fact, that is the fallacy known as affirming the consequent. So how does that apply in this situation? Quite simply as follows. Richard Dawkins presents certain arguments which he claims prove that God does not exist, or to be more precise, that God almost certainly does not exist. That is why people say, well, you need to prove God's existence, or you need to present arguments for believing that God exists. The implication being that if there is no God, then Richard Dawkins' reasoning was correct. Does that logically follow, though? No, it does not. That's the fallacy I was talking about earlier, affirming the consequent. If A implies B, it does not logically mean that B implies A. You can believe that there is no God and at the same time reject the reasoning that Dawkins used. This is precisely why the evolutionary geneticist that I cited earlier, H. Alan Orr, emphasized that he agreed with Dawkins' atheistic conclusion, but disagreed strenuously with the path that he took. In other words, he rejected Dawkins' logic as being completely invalid, as being cheap, amateurish philosophy. That's why I'm disappointed when people keep presenting the argument that I have not argued for God's existence. First of all, I did present reasons for that in my other videos. And second, even if my conclusion is incorrect, it does not, it does not mean that Dawkins was correct. That is why I take great pains to emphasize that even people who agree with his conclusion that there is no God, or that is almost certainly no God, if you wish to be more precise, still reject the logic that he used. Why do I take great pains to emphasize this? Quite simply for this reason. Because this type of reasoning can only muddy the waters of discussion further. Discussions between theists and atheists tend to be heated enough, tend to be confusing enough, tend to be convoluted enough. Let's not muddle them any further by using irrelevant arguments such as this. You know, when people employ arguments like this knowingly, it shows that they're not really interested in meaningful discussion. See, I don't object strenuously when people offer this type of argument once or twice, because I understand sometimes people, that's an emotionally laden issue. However, when people keep offering this argument, even though the fallacy of it has been pointed out over and over again in multiple ways, that's just very disappointing. It leads to unproductive discussions, and that's something that's best avoided.